The wind rolled in from the Atlantic with a cold bite, sweeping over the jagged cliffs and battering the weathered walls of the lighthouse. The structure stood alone on the edge of the world, its once proud beacon long since extinguished. Sea salt had crusted the glass of the lantern room and rust crept along the iron railing like a slow rot. Inside, time moved differently, thick with silence and the weight of old memories. Elliot Gray lived there in quiet routine. He had been a sailor once, long ago, before the ocean had taken what he loved most. A storm without mercy had claimed his family and left him adrift in the world. The lighthouse, abandoned and forgotten by the maritime authorities, had become his refuge. No ships passed close enough anymore to need its light. Still, Elliot climbed the narrow spiral staircase each evening, boots tapping against the iron steps, and stood in the glass room staring out to sea. He never lit the lamp, but he watched the waves as if waiting for a shape to rise from them. As if waiting for the past to return. His only companion was a deaf cat named Weston, mottled gray like the sea in winter. The cat moved silently, often settling beside Elliot without a sound. Tail curled around his paws, eyes always half-lidded but watchful. There was a strange stillness to him, a calm beyond age or nature, as if he too listened for something deep beneath the wind and tide. At night, Weston would rest on the windowsill of the keeper's quarters, unmoving, facing the horizon with the same devotion as his master. Elliot spoke little, even to himself. The lighthouse groaned with age, boards creaking in the night like old bones, and the wind whistled through cracked shutters. He welcomed the noise. Silence was heavier. In the dark hours before dawn, Elliot sometimes dreamed of voices calling through fog, of lanterns swaying on invisible decks, of laughter swallowed by the sea. He would wake in sweat, the taste of salt thick in his mouth. Weston would be there beside him, unmoved, his yellow eyes wide and unblinking, as if he too had seen the dream. The days passed in repetition, marked only by the rhythm of tides and the sound of distant gulls. Elliot mended what could be mended and ignored what couldn't. He left food for Weston, sipped bitter coffee, and maintained the lighthouse as if it still mattered. As if somewhere a vessel might need its light again. And though he told himself he had chosen this exile, some nights he stood in the lantern room and placed a hand on the cold glass, eyes fixed to the horizon, not out of duty, but hope. The fog that rolled in that night was thicker than any Elliot had seen in years. It swallowed the cliffs, the ocean, and even the lighthouse itself in a pale, soundless shroud. The lightless tower stood like a ghost above the sea, its stone bones vanishing into the mist. Elliot climbed the stairs as he always did, Weston trailing silently behind, his tail twitching with unease. At the top, Elliot pressed his forehead to the cool glass and peered into the void. Far beyond the reach of the cliffs, a light appeared. It was faint at first, a flickering speck dancing at the edge of vision. But it grew steadily brighter, not with the constancy of a lantern or the rhythm of a buoy, but in a pulse that seemed to breathe. It hovered low over the waves, swaying slightly, never anchored to any mast or hull. Elliot narrowed his eyes. The light was too high, too unsteady. It moved not with the currents but with deliberate drift, as if carried by an invisible wind. He remained there until the light faded, consumed once more by the shifting wall of fog. Weston sat at his feet the whole time, ears flattened and gaze fixed in the same direction. When Elliot finally turned away, the cat followed but with a stiffness in his steps, his eyes still wide and wary. At first light, Elliot made his way down the cliff path to the shoreline. The fog had lifted but left behind a dampness that clung to everything, and the beach was scattered with debris that hadn't been there the day before. Among the seaweed and driftwood lay the remains of something once cherished. A child's doll, waterlogged and missing an eye, its yarn hair plastered to a cracked porcelain face. Splintered timber fragments, the edges worn but not from time, more like from force. And beside it all, laid carefully across a rock as if placed by a deliberate hand, a map. The paper was soaked through but still legible. Its ink had bled in places, but one mark stood out in bold, unblurred red, an island, uncharted and unnamed, circled as if waiting to be found. Elliot studied the lines, recognizing none of them. The position didn't match any known chart he remembered, but something about it stirred memory, like a song heard long ago. Weston prowled the shoreline behind him, fur bristled and tail flicking erratically. The cat would pause, look out to sea, then back at Elliot, repeating the motion with silent urgency. It was not fear, but anticipation, as if he too had seen the light and now waited for something to return. Elliot stood with the map in his hands and the ocean before him, and for the first time in years, the stillness of the lighthouse was broken by a question he could not ignore. Something had arrived with the fog, something that knew his name without speaking it, something that had waited just beyond the reach of sight. Each night grew heavier with silence that wasn't truly silent. The wind outside no longer howled, it murmured. The creaking of the lighthouse began to carry rhythm, a cadence that resembled fragmented voices. Elliot first believed it was the echo of the sea, the natural groans of an old structure, but soon he noticed the whispers seemed to know the shape of his name. They came from the walls, the floorboards, and sometimes from just behind the closed door of the lantern room, even when no one was there. Sleep offered no refuge. His dreams turned vivid and cruel, replays of the storm that had taken his family years ago. But the memories were altered. The faces changed. Instead of his wife and daughter, he saw children he had never met, men with weathered eyes, women clutching bundles wrapped in cloth. Their mouths moved, but no sound came through the dream. They reached for him, not with terror, but with a plea. Each night the sea roared louder in his mind, and the dreams ended the same way, a great wave rising like a wall, followed by darkness. Troubled by these visions, Elliot turned to the basement beneath the tower. Long sealed and cluttered with remnants from past keepers, it held the kind of silence that waited to be disturbed. He cleared dust from old crates, unlatched rusted cabinets, and uncovered records kept in yellowing ledgers and brittle news clippings. Names, dates, routes, all layered over each other in the quiet tomb of forgotten pages. One name surfaced again and again, the Siren. A passenger ship bound for Halifax, last reported off the coast more than a century ago. There were no survivors, no wreckage recovered, and no distress signal ever sent. The ship had vanished into fog, taking nearly 100 souls with her. The older newspapers mentioned something locals called the Hollow Deep, a stretch of ocean where compasses spun and radios failed. Sailors avoided it, fishermen whispered about it, but no one could point to it on a map. It was legend, a tear in the ocean where the dead waited to be remembered. Among the documents, Elliot found an unmarked folder, brittle from age. Inside was a sketch, the same island from the map he'd found on the beach. Its jagged shape and unfamiliar contours matched perfectly. Scribbled in the margin was a phrase in fading ink, beneath the mist, the forgotten weight. That night, the fog returned, denser than before. The lighthouse windows fogged from within. The whispers grew clearer, forming words in languages he almost understood. Weston refused to leave his side, his blind gaze following every shadow as if watching unseen figures pass. Elliot sat at the desk with the map laid out before him, a candle burning low, the papers surrounding him like forgotten prayers. Something had shifted. The sea was no longer just a horizon, it had become a threshold. The voices were not memories or madness. They were real, carried on tides deeper than water, calling not just to him, but through him from a place where time no longer mattered and the lost remained awake. The wind tore across the cliffs with a scream that night, more feral than any gale Elliot had heard before. The fog pressed thick against the windows of the lighthouse, muting the beam of the dormant lantern and turning the landscape into a gray void. But within that murk, the light returned, a single flickering point, pulsing like a heartbeat across the water. It hovered in a direction the sea charts never named, the same bearing marked on the water-damaged map he had recovered days ago. Elliot watched it from the top of the tower until the pull became too strong to resist. With a determination that felt older than himself, he descended the spiraling stairs, gathered the map, and walked into the storm. The boathouse groaned under the pressure of the wind, but the old rowboat still floated, moored and waiting like it had always known this moment would come. He pushed it into the surf, his hands steady despite the rain. As the boat rocked, ready to drift, Weston emerged from the shadows and leapt into the hull without hesitation. Elliot did not question it. They left the shore in silence, swallowed quickly by the mist. The sea was strange that night. Though the waves were rough near the coast, they calmed as he ventured deeper into the fog, as if the waters themselves were holding their breath. The air grew colder, heavy with salt and the scent of forgotten storms. Time unraveled. Hours passed without motion or sound, until a shape emerged from the gray wall before them. The island appeared without warning. A mass of jagged rock and twisted trees draped in hanging moss, as though it had risen straight from the ocean floor. Elliot beached the boat on a sliver of shore and stepped into the silence. No birds cried. No wind stirred the trees. The island felt untouched by the world, sealed in a moment that did not belong to the present. Weston stayed close, his paws silent on the damp stones. They climbed toward the island's heart, where a crumbling tower rose above the canopy, another lighthouse, but long since abandoned. Its structure leaned slightly, beaten by time and tide, yet still standing like a sentinel watching over nothing. Inside, the air was colder. The walls bore the same spiral markings he had seen in the old ship logs. Faded paintings, scratched letters, and broken lanterns lined the interior. At the top of the spiral staircase was a room unlike the rest, dry, preserved, and impossibly clean. In its center stood an upright mirror framed in dark wood. It was unbroken, though the glass shimmered unnaturally in the gloom. Elliot approached and looked into it, but the reflection did not show him. The glass held the image of an endless black sea under starlight. From its depths rose figures, some half-submerged, others staring forward with eyes that held memories no living soul could carry. He saw children gripping lifebelts, women cradling each other, sailors holding rusted tools. The passengers of the Siren. They were neither alive nor entirely gone, caught between tides of time. Their faces turned toward him in recognition, not of who he was, but of what he was, a witness. The mirror pulsed faintly, not with menace but with request. Elliot understood then. He had not come to find them. They had brought him here, not to save, not to release, but to remember, to carry their story back across the veil of time and fog, to ensure that what had vanished would not stay forgotten. The sea had taken their voices, but now it had given him theirs. He stepped back, his breath shallow and his hands trembling. Weston sat still, his head tilted, as if seeing the same truths through blind eyes. Outside, the wind stirred again, but softer this time, carrying a whisper not of warning but of permission. The chamber grew still, as if the air itself had paused to listen. Elliot stood before the mirror, his reflection still absent, the sea of faces within it suspended in silence. He felt the weight of decades press against his chest, not from the storm outside but from the one he had carried within him for so long. Memories, once buried beneath years of solitude, rose unbidden. Salt water, cries in the dark, shattered wood, and the silence that followed. He had always known the truth, though he had never spoken it aloud. That night so many years ago, when the Siren met the storm, he had not been pulled into the sea by force or fate. He had jumped. In a moment of terror, faced with the chaos of breaking decks and rising waves, he had chosen survival over duty. He had seen others, passengers clinging to railings, calling for help, but he had turned away. The cold had bitten into his skin as he struck the water, but it was not the sea that left the deepest mark. It was the knowledge that he had lived while the rest had vanished beneath the surface. When he was rescued days later, adrift and broken, he gave a version of the story that spared him the shame. He claimed the storm had taken them too quickly, that he had been thrown overboard by chance. Authorities accepted it. No one questioned the lone survivor too deeply. But the dead had remembered, and now so had he. Elliot stepped closer to the mirror. The figures within remained still, their faces no longer pleading but waiting. He spoke not with his voice, but with his presence, letting the truth move through him. He opened himself to the guilt, to the fear, to the weight of his silence. He offered no excuses, only the confession long denied. The storm that had once torn the ship apart had never truly ended. It had followed him, lived within him, whispered through the creaking beams of the lighthouse. As the final thought passed through his mind, the sea in the mirror began to fade. One by one, the faces dissolved into mist, not violently but gently, as though released from a long vigil. The glass cleared, showing only Elliot and the dim outline of Weston beside him. The silence that followed was unlike any other, a stillness born not of absence, but of peace. Outside, the wind that had haunted the island died down. The trees no longer bent under invisible hands. The air, once heavy with unspoken voices, felt light. Weston turned to Elliot, his blind gaze calm, and for a moment it seemed as though he understood everything that had passed. Elliot placed a hand on the cat's back, his fingers steady now. In that quiet room at the heart of the forgotten island, something unseen had shifted. Not erased, not undone, but acknowledged. And for the first time in many years, Elliot Gray felt the sea grow calm. Elliot returned to the old lighthouse in silence. The island had released its grip, the voices had faded, and the restless lights that once danced on the horizon no longer appeared. Yet he felt no emptiness. The weight that had once bent his shoulders had lifted, replaced by a quiet resolve. Every evening, as the sky turned to ash and the sea darkened into a velvet abyss, he climbed the narrow stairs to the lantern room. Though the great light had long since ceased to function, he opened the rusted shutters and stood there, watching over the ocean. The ritual had changed meaning. He no longer searched for ships nor waited for signs. He simply stood in silence, knowing that the light, though unseen, now burned within him. Weston always accompanied him, the old cat moving with deliberate steps, settling beside him with a slow curl of his tail. Though deaf and slow, the cat never missed the evening climb. Together they faced the wind, the salt, the dusk. Years passed. The seasons drifted like tide and fog, gentle in their repetition. Elliot grew older, his body weaker, his face more weathered, but his eyes remained steady and his hand never failed to open the shutters. Eventually, the visits ceased. No one saw the lantern room opened anymore, nor the figure standing like a sentinel against the dying light. Concerned, some villagers crossed the narrow channel and made the climb to the lighthouse door. It opened easily. Inside they found no sign of Elliot or Weston, only dust, salt-streaked walls, and the faint scent of brine in the air. The rooms were untouched, as if their occupants had simply stepped out for a moment and forgotten to return. On the desk near the stairs sat the old map, now brittle with age. In the corner of the room stood the same cracked mirror that Elliot had once carried from the island. Its surface was slightly fogged, the kind of mist left by breath or ocean air. Drawn across the glass, as if by a fingertip, were words that had not been there before. 3 simple words written with the softness of memory: "We are home." As the villagers stood in stillness, unsure of what they had found, a low sound stirred from outside, soft, steady, like a gentle purr carried on the fog. It rose from the cliffs and drifted out across the sea, fading into the vast gray distance. The lighthouse remained quiet, empty of its keeper, but somehow whole again. The lantern never lit again, but no one ever said the place was dark.